biggest of right now. Wilder, Fury 2, here we go.
But with this, well, the rumor mill has already started spinning as far as what did this past weekend's welterweight contest do on pay-per-view. Michael Woods posted this excerpt with some quotes from Bob Arum himself, and Bob had this to say. He said,
I heard the satellite and dish numbers were minuscule. Cable really underperformed, way lower than they thought it would do. They were hoping to do 300,000 buys.
Now I'm going to preface everything I'm about to say with this. You can take these comments from Bob Arum at face value. You can believe whatever the hell it is you want to believe.
You can.
And if you believe that this pay-per-view underperformed, it's your prerogative. Myself, I can believe that the pay-per-view did under 300,000 buys, but I can believe that because of outlying factors. Not because Bob said it did under 300,000, but because of all the other stuff. Because nobody was asking for this fight, you understand. Danny Garcia is not this era's Wilfredo Benitez or Felix Trinidad. He's never been in tune with the Puerto Rican fight fans the way Puerto Rican fighters of old have been in tune with those fans and commanded that audience, an audience that would show up in the numbers. Danny has never been that guy. Danny is not this era's equivalent to Benitez, or Camacho, or Trinidad, or Cotto. He is not to the Puerto Rican fight fan what those fighters were to the Puerto Rican fight fan. So he's not bringing that to the table in terms of numbers, you understand. He's just not. It's for this reason that I can believe that the pay-per-view underperformed, because whoever was interested in seeing this thing was in all likelihood interested in just one of the two fighters in the fight. Just one. Errol Spence Jr. And Errol Spence Jr. in and of himself is not a megastar. He's not.
Not yet.
This guy can't bring you in 500,000 pay-per-view buys off his name and his name alone. He's not there. He's not there yet. And it gets very contentious when it comes to Errol, as far as whether or not he's a bona fide pay-per-view attraction, whether or not he's really a draw, because, you know, the best set of numbers that he brought in on pay-per-view involved a Mexican fighter. And we all know that in America, Mexican fighters move the needle. Talking about his pay-per-view debut, the Mikey Garcia fight. You ask Errol Spence Jr.'s fans, everybody in attendance, everybody in the arena, and all the viewers at home were tuning in to see Errol, when in reality, a good number of those viewers were tuning in to support Mikey. As we all know, in America, the Chicano fight fans move the needle. That's what you can attribute the success of a Canelo Alvarez to. It's not a secret that Canelo Alvarez's worst numbers just so happen to be Errol Spence Jr.'s best numbers, or in the neighborhood of them.
Exactly.
It's questionable whether or not Errol Spence Jr. is a bona fide pay-per-view attraction. And it's for this reason that I can believe the pay-per-view underperformed. Not because Bob said it, but because of these outlying factors. We have to factor in COVID into it as well. We have to factor in inflated pay-per-view prices for a fight most fight fans weren't asking for at a time when a lot of people are strapped for cash. Gotta remember, this pay-per-view is about $30 more expensive than that Mike Tyson versus Roy Jones Jr. exhibition match 2 weeks ago. That featured more familiar faces than this pay-per-view did, and it was at a reduced price. You know, compared to this thing. This thing's almost $100. Was almost $100. To see two guys that ain't even household names on that premise, yeah, I can believe that the pay-per-view underperformed. I can believe that it did under 300,000 buys. Which kind of brings me back to that article published post-fight by Kevin Ioli over there at Yahoo Sports, where he discussed this pay-per-view and the current landscape in the American boxing market. He's essentially castigating these guys. Portion of the article reads, "The public needs to demand more. It's largely rejecting these bloated, overpriced pay-per-view shows. What is going to happen with this one," he was talking about the Spence versus Garcia fight. He said, "What's going to happen with this one is that the pay-per-view will sell around 200,000, maybe 225,000, and someone will leak to a reporter that it was 300,000, 325,000. They think that will create an illusion of health in an industry that is dying on the vine." Essentially, what Kevin Iole is communicating to the reader is that a lot of times when the numbers are reported for these pay-per-views, they're not exactly accurate. The numbers are being fudged. They're being exaggerated.
But why?
One is left to wonder, why would they do this? Why lie? What's the benefit in that? Well, if you're handling Errol Spence Jr.'s career, and you want him to be Captain fucking A-side to anybody at 147 pounds, you don't want people knowing that his pay-per-views are actually underperforming, that he isn't a pay-per-view attraction, that he isn't a pay-per-view star. He's developing into a draw locally. I don't doubt that the people down there in Texas are head over heels over this guy. From the looks of things, they are. It's just that everywhere else, nationwide, no, this guy's not a household name, and he's not yet a bona fide pay-per-view attraction. What Kevin Iole is saying is that a lot of times when these numbers get reported, the numbers are fudged. And who's been staging more pay-per-views than anybody as of late? The last, I don't know, 1-2 years?
Who?
I'll tell you who. The people over there at the PBC. Canelo Alvarez ain't bothering to gamble on pay-per-view buys anymore. He decided to take the guaranteed cash from DAZN. And even though he has since parted ways with Golden Boy Promotions, hey, where's that guy's next fight?
It's on DAZN.
These different pay-per-views we've been seeing the last 2.5 years have been coming from the same outfit. It's been coming from the PBC.
They have.
Coincidentally, Kevin Iole is communicating that, a lot of the times, those reported buys, that's not what the pay-per-views are actually doing. The pay-per-views are actually underperforming, and people are losing money. To the point, why would they bother exaggerating about the numbers when that's not going to help anything? They figure that if they tell a little white lie, and they exaggerate about the numbers a little bit, that will give off the appearance of their fighter being a bigger draw than that fighter actually is, and hopefully they can use that as leverage in negotiations. That if any one of these other outfits out there want to use my fighter for any reason at all, hey, my fighter's got to be the A-side.
Sound familiar?
I mean, who do you always hear screaming this stuff? PBC fighters. When in reality, people aren't all that interested in Errol Spence Jr., devoid of a Terrence Crawford fight.
He's a draw locally.
He is in his own backyard, but so's Terrence Crawford. Terrence Crawford's a draw locally in his own backyard in Omaha, Nebraska. Ultimately, neither one of these two guys are big enough a star that they can afford to stay away from each other. All the attention they're getting is for what is to be their fight, assuming it ever happens. After 3 years of waiting, 3 years of marinating, the time for that fight is now, and whatever attention either one of these two guys is getting is in reference to the fight the fans want them to have with each other. But the PBC don't see it that way. They want to live in their island, live in their bubble where they can operate independently of the rest of the world of boxing. They want to create an environment where Errol don't need Terrence Crawford. And I'll tell you what, you can have him fight your assembly line of PBC guys. You can do that. But that's only going to get you so far. You're never going to hit that next stratosphere doing things that way. You can have Errol Spence Jr. fight your assembly line of PBC fighters, but not one of those fights with one of those guys is the fight that the fight fans want. And it's their money you're trying to get at. It's their viewership, their patronage. And until you give them what they want, there's always going to be a cap on what your fighters are doing. The story here is that, according to Bob, this pay-per-view underperformed. It sold less than 300,000 buys. Coincidentally, Kevin Iole, in reference to all these pay-per-views we've been seeing, he's saying that these pay-per-views are actually underperforming and people are actually losing money. And they're lying about it for appearance's sake. Those things in mind, yeah, I can believe that Spence versus Garcia did less than 300,000 buys. And I can believe that the PBC are going to lie about it. Maybe in a day or two we see an article from a Mike Colpinger or somebody saying that the pay-per-view did 325, 350,000 buys.
That could happen.
That wouldn't surprise me at all, because before any of this was even published, before any of this was even said, I put the buy rate for this thing in this environment during COVID times at around 250,000 buys. That's the number I thought the pay-per-view would hit. I'm a boxing fan, and I know for a fact that this is not the fight that the fight fans want to see. The paying public, not these talking heads on social media. The actual guys that go into their wallets to pay for a fight when a good fight gets made. That's the fight the paying public is waiting for. And that's the fight they've been waiting for 3 fucking years. And you're not going to get the reception for Spence versus Garcia that you would get for Spence versus Crawford. But people got to be realistic on both sides of the aisle. Otherwise, it's the industry itself that suffers for it. In heavyweight news, per tweet from Michael Benson, Tyson Fury has now declared that he will not be ringside for Anthony Joshua versus Kubrat Pulev on Saturday night. And that's not really an encouraging omen. Not if you're holding out hope that Anthony Joshua's very next fight after Kubrat Pulev ends up being Tyson Fury, though in truth, that was never a guarantee. I mean, think about it this way. The last time Tyson Fury was in action was February of this year,
right?
Several months ago, towards the beginning of the year. And if the idea was that, Anthony Joshua takes care of Pulev and moves into the Fury fight, it could very well be that the night of the fight, Fury will not have fought for 12 months. What could be 12 months?
Night of the fight.
So in a situation like that, what you have to ask yourself is, do you think that Fury would take the fight on under those circumstances? Tyson Fury tried to get out there one more time before this year was out, and for one reason or another, he was not able to. Now, perhaps, had he been able to have that fight with, who was it, Agit Kabayel, then maybe that would be a more encouraging omen. But as it stands, the fight didn't materialize.
Didn't do it.
And if the fight don't materialize, you think Tyson Fury's going to approach an Anthony Joshua fight, having to shake off cobwebs and ring rust? I don't think so. Eddie Hearn was quoted as saying, "Our job over the next couple of weeks is to get that Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury fight in place. If AJ beats Pulev, we want to go into the governing bodies and say, deal agreed, contract signed, and this is the proposed date. Will you sanction it as an undisputed fight?" Well, that's what Eddie wants to do, and I think that's what a lot of the fight fans want to see. But at the same time, we've heard AJ's comments recently that, he feels like Usyk is, in all likelihood, the next guy he's going to fight, because when Usyk says he's going to fight someone, that's what happens. Whereas with Tyson Fury, you can never really take him at his word, because he usually goes back on it. Just the question that we need to ask ourselves is, do we believe in our heart of hearts that if Joshua beats Pulev, the next fight thereafter is going to be the Tyson Fury fight? If Joshua beats Pulev, do you think the Fury fight gets made right after that? That's the question. With that question in mind, I have to say that unfortunately there is room for doubt. There is. Because if nothing else, Tyson Fury in that situation would be walking into an Anthony Joshua fight in 2021, having only fought once in 2020. And there could be 12 months in between both of those fights. Does that seem like a likely scenario that Tyson Fury would walk into? That he might walk into an Anthony Joshua fight having not fought in 12 months. Does that seem likely to you guys?
I don't think so.
And finally, per tweet from Sarah Shepard, speaking earlier today with Eddie Hearn, said he's in the process of finalizing Josh Warrington versus Kansu for early 2021. One of 3 fights he hopes to announce on Saturday, together with Light versus Povetkin 2 and Josh Kelly versus David Abanesian. I've expressed my sentiments about this fight in the past, given the styles of both Josh Warrington and Kansu, who in all likelihood will be elevated to full champions so that the match can be billed as a unification match. It's a sensational fight. Both guys are guys who really like to throw. They really let their hands go, and I'm very glad to see that the fight is set to go down early next year. And in light of this news, what comes to mind, at least for me, is the WBC champion.
Who's that?
Gary Russell Jr., the longest active reigning champion in the sport of boxing here today. And what I'm thinking is, regardless of who the winner of this fight is, once a winner emerges, I don't want to hear any of this stuff about how fucking great Gary Russell Jr. is. I don't. I understand that Leo Santa Cruz could have fought Gary Russell Jr. and should have fought Gary Russell Jr. But Leo Santa Cruz was just one of 3 other champions at the weight that Gary could have pursued.
It's true.
So Leo Santa Cruz isn't giving you the time of day. What's stopping you from going over there and taking care of Josh Warrington for his IBF title? What was stopping Gary Russell Jr. from pursuing a fight with Shakur Stevenson when he was the WBO champion, or pursuing a fight with Oscar Valdez, who was the WBO champion before him? What happened to Gary Russell Jr.'s ultimatum that he made to Al Heyman in reference to a Leo Santa Cruz fight, that if Al doesn't deliver that fight, what Gary's going to do is go over there to Top Rank and see about moving up in weight and having a fight with Miguel Berchelt? As it stands, Oscar Valdez ended up doing what Gary said he was going to do. Essentially, Gary Russell Jr. is all talk. You know, he might be the longest reigning champion at this weight, but big part of the reason that is because the guy barely fights.
Yeah.
When you're only fighting once a year for the last, 5 or 6 years, it's a little easier to hold on to that title because you don't get out there as much as some other guys. So if you couldn't get that fight with Leo Santa Cruz, he wasn't the only guy there that you could have unified with. You could have saw about getting a Josh Taylor fight. I mean,
Warrington.
he mentioned Gary by name. He could have saw about having a fight with that guy. He could have saw about having a fight with Oscar Valdez or Shakur Stevenson when he came into being a champion. Emmanuel Navarrete, he is currently the WBO champion at this weight. Gary Russell Jr. hasn't so much as batted an eyelash at that guy. You see, the reason I mention this, the reason I highlight this is, as far as I'm concerned, the winner of Josh Warrington versus Kansu will be the premier featherweight in the division, the only unified champion at the weight. Numero uno.
Not Gary Russell.
As far as I'm concerned, the featherweight division would be better off without Gary. Yeah, I said it, all right? So long as Gary's there, nobody's going to get the chance to unify their title with his, because he won't fight them. For all his talk of not being a PBC fighter, that the PBC is just an outfit he does business with.
Right.
For all that talk, he's still there. He doesn't fight anywhere else. I would prefer that Gary Russell Jr. leave the featherweight division so that maybe there's a chance, a remote chance, that someone could pick up that WBC title and unify it with someone else's. That's what I'm holding out hope for.